Well, hello there, my dear friends. Come on in, settle yourself into that favorite chair of yours, and let me pour you a warm cup of something comforting while we spend a little time together today. I'm Joe, though most folks around these parts have come to know me as Grandpa Joe over the years, and I'm grateful beyond measure that you've chosen to share a piece of your precious day with me here. You know, at six, I've come to understand that some of life's most valuable lessons arrive wrapped in the most uncomfortable packages. The experiences that teach us the most about ourselves often come disguised as failures, as moments of embarrassment so profound they make us want to disappear into the floorboards. And today, I want to share one of those stories with you, a story about overconfidence, about the dangerous gap between knowing facts and possessing wisdom, and about how sometimes the most humbling experiences become the foundation for everything good that follows. Before we settle into this journey together, if these conversations we share bring you comfort during quiet moments, perhaps remind you of your own stories of growth and learning, or simply provide a friendly voice when the world feels too fast and impersonal, I would be deeply honored if you'd consider subscribing to our little corner of reflection here on the internet. And it helps me reach other souls who might benefit from these tales of learning and growing. And it tells me that what we're sharing together has genuine meaning in your life. Now, let me take you back to a time that feels both like yesterday and an entire lifetime ago, the spring of 1982, when I was 22 years old and absolutely convinced that I knew everything there was to know about the world. It was a time when my confidence far exceeded my wisdom, when I confused having information with having understanding, and when I was about to learn the difference between the two in the most mortifying way possible. Picture, if you will, a young man fresh out of college, walking across the stage to receive his diploma in English literature with honors, his head filled with Shakespeare and Hemingway, his heart pumped full of the kind of confidence that comes from never having truly failed at anything important. That young man was me, and I was absolutely certain that the world was waiting for me to arrive and show everyone how things should be done. I had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Michigan, had been president of the Literary Society, had written articles for the campus newspaper that professors had called insightful and mature beyond his years. My senior thesis on symbolism in American literature had earned me praise from the entire English department. I was, in my own mind, a scholar of the highest order, ready to take my rightful place among the intellectual elite. But more than that, I was convinced that my education had given me not just knowledge, but wisdom, that 4 years of studying great literature had taught me everything I needed to know about human nature, about life, about how the world really worked. I walked around campus that final semester with the kind of swagger that comes from believing you figured out secrets that elude most people. My girlfriend at the time, a sweet, patient girl named Carol, who would later become a brilliant doctor, used to gently suggest that maybe I was getting a little too full of myself. "Joe, hi," she'd say with that knowing smile of hers. "There's a difference between being smart and being wise. Maybe you should think about that." But I was too intoxicated by my own perceived brilliance to listen. The job market in 1982 wasn't particularly welcoming to English majors, but I wasn't worried. After all, I reasoned, anyone would be lucky to have someone with my educational credentials. My analytical mind, my deep understanding of literature and human nature, and I sent out applications to newspapers, magazines, publishing houses. Anywhere I thought my obvious talents would be appreciated, most of my applications disappeared into the void. But eventually I received a call that made my heart soar. Morrison and Associates, a respected advertising agency in Detroit, wanted to interview me for a position as a junior copywriter. The salary they mentioned was more than my father had been making at the Ford plant when he started there. This was it, my chance to step into the professional world and show them what a truly educated person could accomplish. I spent a week preparing for that interview, but not in the way you might think. Instead of researching the company, understanding their clients, or learning about the advertising industry, I spent my time rehearsing how I would impress them with my intellectual credentials. I planned to quote Shakespeare and to reference Thoreau, to demonstrate the depth of my literary knowledge. And after all, advertising was just writing. And who better to write than someone who had studied the greatest writers in human history? I selected my interview outfit with the care of someone choosing armor for battle. My best suit, a tie that I thought made me look sophisticated, shoes polished to a mirror shine, but more than my physical preparation, I armored myself with an attitude of intellectual superiority that makes me cringe to remember even now. 43 years later, the morning of the interview arrived crisp and clear. One of those perfect May days when everything feels possible. I drove downtown to the Morrison & Associates offices in my father's borrowed car, practicing my opening lines, rehearsing the impressive way I would discuss my educational background and literary insights. The Morrison & Associates building was everything I'd imagined a serious advertising agency would be. Sleek glass and steel, modern furniture in the lobby, well-dressed people moving with purposeful energy. As I waited to be called, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, among people who would finally appreciate my intellectual gifts. Joseph Morrison, a woman in her 30s, appeared, dressed in a sharp business suit that spoke of competence and authority. "I'm Linda Hartwell, creative director. Ready for our chat?" She led me through a maze of offices and conference rooms filled with people hunched over drawing boards and typewriters, the walls covered with advertisements and campaign materials that I barely glanced at. I was too busy preparing my opening statements about the relevance of classical literature to modern communication. Linda's office was spacious and bright, with windows overlooking downtown Detroit. The walls were covered with awards and advertisements from campaigns she'd clearly directed. Her desk was covered with materials from various client projects, and I could see she was someone who was deeply engaged with her work. "So, Joseph," she said, settling behind her desk and opening my file, "tell me why you're interested in advertising." This was my moment. I launched into what I thought was a brilliant monologue about how advertising was really just applied psychology, how my study of literature had given me unique insights into human motivation, how the great writers had always understood persuasion better than anyone in business. I quoted Hemingway on the power of understated emotion. I referenced Shakespeare's understanding of universal human desires. I explained how my analysis of symbolism in American literature had prepared me to create advertising that spoke to people's deepest psychological needs. Linda listened with what I interpreted as respectful attention, occasionally nodding or making notes. I was feeling increasingly confident, certain that I was impressing her with the depth and sophistication of my thinking. "That's interesting," she said when I finally paused for breath. "And how do you think that literary background would help you write copy for, say, automotive accounts?" I barely hesitated. "Well, cars are really about freedom and identity, aren't they? The same themes Kerouac explored in On the Road, but the American relationship with automobiles is fundamentally about the frontier spirit that you see in Twain and Steinbeck." She made another note, and I felt a little surge of pride. Clearly, she was impressed by my ability to connect literature to commercial concerns. "I see you don't have any experience in advertising specifically," she continued. "How would you approach writing copy for a client in an industry you're not familiar with?" This was where I really thought I could shine. "That's the beauty of a liberal arts education," I said with what I'm sure was insufferable confidence. "When you understand human nature at the deepest level, when you've studied how the greatest minds in history have moved people with words, the specific industry doesn't really matter. Good writing's good writing. Whether it's Dickens describing Victorian London or an advertisement for soap." I went on to explain how my education had given me analytical tools that could be applied to any communication challenge, how someone with my background could bring a level of sophistication to advertising that was typically missing in such a commercial field. And looking back now, and I can see exactly what was happening in that room. So Linda Hartwell was a seasoned professional who had been creating successful advertising campaigns for over a decade, and she understood her industry, her clients, and her craft at a level I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And here was this 22-year-old kid, fresh out of college, essentially telling her that his book learning made him more qualified to do her job than she was. But I was oblivious to the growing tension in the room, and I was so intoxicated by the sound of my own voice, so convinced that I was demonstrating my intellectual superiority, that I completely missed the warning signs. "Mihal Mishtamandam," Linda said, her voice carefully neutral. "What do you know about our agency, about our clients, and the work we do?" I should have realized this was a test, should have heard the slight edge in her voice. Instead, I saw it as another opportunity to demonstrate my analytical abilities. "Well, I know you're a full-service agency," I said confidently. "But honestly, I think that level of detail is less important than bringing the right intellectual framework to the work. And once you understand the fundamental principles of human psychology and effective communication, which is really what literature teaches you, the specifics of any particular business become secondary." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, but I pressed on, digging my hole deeper with every word. "I think what advertising really needs is people who can bring genuine intellectual rigor to the field," I continued. "Too often, commercial writing lacks the sophistication that comes from understanding how language really works, how it can move people at a deeper level than just selling products." Melinda set down her pen and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd started talking. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her eyes should have warned me that I was about to walk off a cliff. "Joseph," she said quietly, "do you know who our biggest client is?" I admitted I didn't, but suggested that it didn't really matter because the principles of effective communication were universal. "Our biggest client is Ford Motor Company," she said, her voice still carefully controlled. "We've handled their account for 8 years. Last year, our campaigns helped them increase market share by 3.2%, which translated to approximately 180,000 additional vehicle sales and $2.8 billion in revenue." Letting those numbers sink in while I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. The campaign that achieved those results took 6 months of research, dozens of focus groups, and the combined expertise of market researchers, copywriters, art directors, media planners, and account executives who collectively have over 200 years of experience in this industry. My mouth was starting to feel dry, but she wasn't finished. "You've been sitting in my office for 20 minutes explaining to me that none of that matters because you've read Shakespeare. You've told me that understanding our clients' businesses is secondary to your theoretical knowledge. You've essentially argued that your literature degree makes you more qualified to create effective advertising than people who have been succeeding in this field for decades." The blood was rushing to my face as the full horror of what I'd been doing began to dawn on me. But Linda still wasn't done. "You know what you haven't done?" she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You haven't asked a single question about our work, our challenges, or our goals. You haven't shown any curiosity about what makes advertising effective or what our clients need. You haven't demonstrated any understanding of the difference between academic writing and commercial communication." She stood up from her desk, and I knew the interview was over. "Joseph, I'm sure you're very smart. Your grades certainly suggest that, but sitting here today, you've shown me something that's far more important than intelligence. And you've shown it in the worst possible way. You've shown me that you believe knowledge without experience equals wisdom. You've demonstrated that you think understanding theory is the same as understanding practice." Her words were hitting me like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of my carefully constructed self-image. "But most importantly," she continued, her voice now carrying a note of genuine disappointment that was somehow worse than anger would have been, "you've shown me that you think your education makes you superior to people who've spent their careers mastering their craft. That's not intelligence. Joseph, That's arrogance. And arrogance is the enemy of learning. She walked to her office door and opened it. The clear signal that our meeting was over. "Let me give you some free advice," she said as I gathered my things with hands that were shaking with embarrassment and shock. Knowledge without humility is just arrogance. Until you understand the difference between knowing about something and actually understanding it, until you learn to respect the expertise of people who've been doing this work while you were reading books about it, you're not ready for this industry. Maybe you're not ready for any industry. I mumbled something that might have been a thank you and fled from that office, my face burning with shame, my mind reeling from the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about myself and my qualifications. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like it lasted hours. I couldn't look at my reflection in the polished steel doors because I was too mortified by what I'd see there. Not the sophisticated intellectual I'd imagined myself to be, but an arrogant kid who'd just made a complete fool of himself in front of someone whose respect I should have been trying to earn. I sat in my father's car in the parking garage for almost an hour, too humiliated to drive home and face the questions about how the interview had gone. How could I explain to my parents, to Carol, to anyone, that I'd walked into what should have been a straightforward job interview and essentially insulted the interviewer by suggesting that her years of professional experience were less valuable than my college degree? But more than the embarrassment, what devastated me was the slow, creeping realization that Linda Hartwell had been absolutely right about everything. I had walked into that office believing that my education made me superior to people who had spent years mastering their craft. I had confused knowing about something with actually understanding it. I had been arrogant in the most fundamental way possible. And over the following month, as I replayed every awful moment of that interview, I began to understand what had really happened in that room. And I hadn't just failed to get a job. I had received an education more valuable than anything I'd learned in 4 years of college. I had learned the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between theory and practice, between confidence and arrogance. Linda Hartwell's words echoed in my head for weeks. Knowledge without humility is just arrogance. The more I thought about them, the more I realized they contained a truth that no professor had ever taught me, a lesson that couldn't be found in any textbook. I had spent 4 years accumulating knowledge, but I had somehow missed the fundamental wisdom that knowledge means nothing without the humility to understand its limitations. And I had learned to analyze literature, but I had failed to learn how to listen. I had mastered academic writing, but I had never learned to respect practical expertise. That interview became a turning point in my life, though it took me years to fully understand its significance. In the immediate aftermath, I was simply humiliated and confused. I had been so certain of my intellectual superiority, so confident in my qualifications, that the reality of my complete failure was almost impossible to process. But slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild my understanding of myself and my place in the world. Started reading not just for intellectual stimulation, but to understand how little I actually knew about most things. I began approaching every new situation not as an opportunity to demonstrate my knowledge, but as a chance to learn something I hadn't known before. And it took me 3 more months to find another job as a junior reporter at a small weekly newspaper 40 miles outside Detroit. The pay was terrible, the work was unglamorous, and my colleagues were mostly people who had learned their craft through years of practice rather than academic study. It was exactly what I needed. My editor at that newspaper was a gruff, experienced journalist named Sam Peterson, who had been covering local news for 25 years. He had never been to college, but he knew more about effective communication than all my literature professors combined. Or more importantly, he understood something about teaching that I desperately needed to learn. On my first day, Sam handed me an assignment to cover a city council meeting and said, "Joe, I know you're smart and educated, and that's fine. But smart doesn't mean wise, and educated doesn't mean experienced. You're going to start by learning how to ask good questions and listen to the answers. Everything else comes after that." Over the next 2 years, Sam taught me everything Linda Hartwell had been trying to tell me in that devastating interview. He taught me that real expertise comes from combining knowledge with experience, theory with practice, confidence with humility. He showed me that the best way to demonstrate intelligence is not to prove how much you know, but to prove how much you are willing to learn. But perhaps most importantly, Sam taught me to respect the expertise of people whose knowledge came from different sources than mine. The farmers I interviewed knew things about soil and weather that couldn't be learned in any classroom. The business owners I wrote about understood practical economics in ways that no textbook could convey. The elderly residents I profiled had accumulated wisdom about life and human nature that made my literary analysis seem trivial by comparison. So working at that small newspaper, I learned that there are many different kinds of intelligence, many different ways of understanding the world. I learned that academic knowledge was just one tool among many, valuable but not superior to practical experience, theoretical understanding, emotional intelligence, or simple common sense. More than that, I learned the art of humility, not as self-deprecation or false modesty, but as a genuine appreciation for how much there was to learn from every person I encountered. To discover that approaching people with curiosity rather than the assumption that I already understood them led to much better stories, deeper insights, and more meaningful connections. The young man who had walked into Linda Hartwell's office, convinced of his intellectual superiority, gradually transformed into someone who understood that wisdom begins with recognizing the limits of your own knowledge. I learned to ask better questions, to listen more carefully, to approach every interview and every story with genuine humility about how much I didn't know. Plus, this transformation wasn't easy or quick. There were many moments over those early years when my old arrogance would resurface, when I'd catch myself assuming I understood something better than I actually did. But each time, I'd remember Linda Hartwell's words, "Knowledge without humility is just arrogance." And I'd force myself to step back, ask more questions, and listen more carefully. But years later, when I became a teacher myself, I found that the lesson I'd learned in that humiliating interview became the foundation of my entire approach to education. I understood that my job wasn't just to transfer knowledge to my students, but to help them develop the humility necessary to continue learning throughout their lives. And I told my students about that job interview, about the danger of confusing information with understanding, about the importance of approaching every new situation with curiosity rather than the assumption that you already have the answers. And I wanted them to learn what had taken me so long to understand, that true intelligence isn't about proving how much you know, but about recognizing how much you still need to learn. Over the decades that followed, as I moved from journalism to teaching, as I built a marriage with my beloved Patricia and raised children of my own, that lesson about humility continued to shape every aspect of my life. When I became a father, I approached it not as someone who naturally knew how to raise children, but as someone who needed to learn from other parents, from my children themselves, and from the inevitable mistakes I would make along the way. When I faced challenges in my marriage, I didn't assume that my education had taught me how relationships worked, when instead, I listened to Patricia, learned from older couples who had built successful marriages, and approached each conflict as an opportunity to understand something new about love and partnership. As I grew older and took on leadership roles in my school and community, I remembered Linda Hartwell's lesson and made sure to surround myself with people whose expertise complemented my own. I learned to value practical experience as much as theoretical knowledge, to seek advice from people who had succeeded in areas where I was still learning. That job interview, as mortifying as it was at the time, became one of the most valuable experiences of my life. It taught me that the real mark of intelligence isn't how much you know, but how willing you are to admit what you don't know. It showed me that wisdom comes not from accumulating information, but from understanding the relationship between knowledge and humility. I can look back on that embarrassing day in Linda Hartwell's office with something approaching gratitude. It was painful and humiliating, but it was also necessary. It stripped away the arrogance that would have limited my ability to learn and grow throughout my life. It taught me the difference between being smart and being wise, between confidence and humility, between knowledge and understanding. My friends, I share this story with you because I believe it contains lessons that become even more important as we age. In our later years, it's easy to become set in our ways, convinced that our accumulated experience and knowledge have given us all the answers we need. But the truth is that life continues to offer opportunities to learn and grow. No matter how old we are, the world is changing rapidly around us, and the knowledge and skills that served us well in our careers may not be sufficient for navigating the challenges of aging, retirement, and the changing society we're living in. New technologies, evolving social norms, different approaches to health and wellness, all of these require us to approach them with the same humility I should have shown in that job interview 43 years ago. I've watched many of my peers struggle with this challenge. While I won't become defensive about the changes they don't understand, insisting that the old ways were better and refusing to adapt. Others become so overwhelmed by all the new information available that they retreat into isolation rather than risk making mistakes while learning. But I've also seen friends and colleagues who approach these later years with the kind of humility that allows for continued growth and discovery. They ask their grandchildren to teach them about technology. They take classes at the local college to learn about subjects they were never exposed to in their careers. They volunteer in ways that expose them to new perspectives and different ways of understanding the world. These are the people who seem to age most successfully, who remain vibrant and engaged not because they have all the answers, but because they maintain their curiosity about life and their willingness to keep learning. They understand that wisdom isn't about reaching a point where you know everything you need to know. It's about maintaining the humility to recognize that there's always more to discover. This perspective becomes especially important when it comes to relationships with younger generations, and it's tempting to assume that our accumulated experience gives us wisdom that younger people lack. And certainly we do have valuable insights to share. But if we approach these relationships with the assumption that we have nothing to learn from people who are decades younger than us, we miss out on perspectives and insights that could enrich our understanding of the world. I think about my grandchildren, who have grown up in a world so different from the one I knew at their age. They understand technology, social dynamics, and global connections in ways that sometimes seem almost foreign to them, but instead of dismissing their perspectives as naive or uninformed, I try to approach them with the same curiosity I learned to bring to my journalism, asking questions, listening carefully, trying to understand rather than simply waiting for my turn to share what I know. The same principle applies to our relationships with healthcare providers, financial advisors, and other professionals who are helping us navigate the practical challenges of aging. And it's easy to become defensive or dismissive when someone much younger than us tries to give us advice about managing our health or our finances. But if we approach these interactions with humility, recognizing that expertise can come from training and experience even when it's not accompanied by advanced age, we're much more likely to receive the help we need. The lesson Linda Hartwell taught me about knowledge and humility has also shaped how I think about the legacy I want to leave. And in my younger years, I might have focused on demonstrating how much I had learned, on proving my intelligence and competences. But now I understand that the most valuable gift I can give to my children and grandchildren is not my accumulated knowledge, but my example of remaining curious, humble, and open to learning throughout life. I want them to see that growing older doesn't mean having all the answers. It means continuing to ask good questions. I want them to understand that wisdom comes not from accumulating information, but from maintaining the humility to recognize how much we still don't understand about life, relationships, and the world around us. This perspective has made my later years far richer and more interesting than they would have been if I had approached them with the arrogance I showed in that job interview. And instead of feeling threatened by change or defensive about what I don't understand, I approach new challenges and opportunities with curiosity and excitement. Whether it's learning to use new technology, understanding changes in healthcare, adapting to new social norms, or simply trying to be a better husband, father, and grandfather. I approach each challenge with the understanding that I have something to learn, not just something to prove. The humility I learned in Linda Hartwell's office has made me a better listener, a more effective learner, and ultimately a wiser person. It has allowed me to build stronger relationships, adapt more successfully to change, and find joy and discovery throughout my life. My dear friends, if you take only one thing from this story, let it be this: no matter how much you've learned, how much you've experienced, or how much wisdom you've accumulated over the years, there is always more to discover. The willingness to approach new situations with humility and curiosity isn't a sign of weakness or ignorance. It's a sign of true intelligence and wisdom. Whether you're 60 or 70 or 80, whether you're facing retirement, health challenges, family changes, or simply the natural evolution that comes with aging, remember that your value doesn't come from having all the answers, and it comes from your willingness to keep asking questions, to keep learning, to keep growing. Knowledge without humility is indeed just arrogance, as Linda Hartwell taught me so many years ago. But knowledge combined with humility becomes wisdom, and wisdom is what allows us to continue growing, contributing, and finding joy throughout all the seasons of our lives. The next time you find yourself in a situation where you feel tempted to prove how much you know, remember that young man who walked into an advertising agency convinced of his intellectual superiority? Remember that the greatest experts in any field are usually the ones who are most aware of how much they still have to learn. And remember that there is profound beauty in approaching each day with curiosity rather than certainty, with questions rather than assumptions, with humility rather than arrogance. This is how we continue to grow, to learn, and to find meaning and purpose in our lives. No matter how many years we've already lived, the world is still full of mysteries to explore, relationships to deepen, skills to develop, and wisdom to discover. Approach them all with the humility that allows for genuine learning, and you'll find that your later years can be among the richest and most rewarding of your entire life. Thank you for spending this time with me today, for allowing me to share this somewhat embarrassing but ultimately valuable story from my youth. If this tale of arrogance transformed into wisdom has resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with learning humility and finding wisdom in unexpected places. The greatest gift we can give ourselves as we age is the recognition that we never stop having opportunities to learn and grow. Stay curious. My friends, stay humble. And remember that the best is yet to come. Until next time, keep your hearts open to the lessons that life continues to offer. And remember that true wisdom begins with understanding how much we still have to learn.